Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm super excited to share with all of you a guide to wearing Pat Mcgrath at work. So if you're interested in seeing how to make your Pat Mcgrath makeup a bit more everyday friendly and wearable, then just stick around. So first off, just to give you guys some background, I was inspired to do this video actually because of you guys. So I've received several questions and comments on my Pat Mcgrath videos about how to make Pat Mcgrath palettes more wearable for work. I mean, Pat Mcgrath makeup is really expensive, so it would be nice to get some more use out of it. And also, of course, using Pat Mcgrath products is a really nice experience in of itself, so why not try to incorporate that into your everyday routine? So in today's video, I'll be doing a full face of Pat Mcgrath, but with the goal of making it look really simple and relatively minimalist, very natural makeup that you could wear in a very professional setting. Of course, everyone's workplace is different in terms of the expectations around makeup, and of course, everyone has different levels of comfort in terms of what to wear to work. So this video is really based on the premise that you're looking for a more everyday, natural look. In terms of the structure of the video, I'm first going to go ahead and do all of my base and face products and lip products. And then I'll do a deep dive into the Pat Mcgrath Motherships. I have all 9 of them on my desk here, so I will try to give you guys some tips and suggestions in terms of which shades might be good to use for an everyday work look. As always, I'll have very detailed timestamps down below in case you want to hop around in the video. So without further ado, let's dive into today's makeup. So to start out, my face is completely bare right now, so I'm going to go into my Pat Mcgrath foundation. And I have this in the shade Light Medium 13. This is a very liquidous foundation, and it's actually a decent foundation for an everyday wear. So of course, Pat Mcgrath tends to have more of a reputation for kind of runway ready makeup, but this foundation definitely, if you apply a sheer layer, can be a great everyday foundation. So I'm just tapping this in now with a damp beauty blender. And as you can probably see actually from the side where I'm tapping this in, the coverage is actually not that much, especially when applied with a sponge. So as you can maybe see from this side of my face where I've blended it in, it just gave a pretty light layer of coverage. You can still see all of my blemishes quite clearly, but this is great just for everyday wear. So here we have 1 pump on my face. And because my face is breaking out a lot currently, I'm also just going to add 1 more pump and also add some more on my neck. Since this foundation is a little bit deep for me at the moment, this is more of a transitional to maybe summery shade for me, whereas right now I am definitely my winter shade. So here we have 2 light layers on, and again, I think you can tell that this actually provides a pretty sheer coverage overall. So if you haven't tried out this foundation yet, this is a great one to consider for work, even though you might not think that given that it's Pat Mcgrath. Next up, I'm going to go in with my Pat Mcgrath concealer, which I have in the shade LM10. And this is a very full coverage concealer, so this is kind of on the opposite spectrum of that foundation. So typically I don't actually use this foundation for work, but I think if you use this in a very targeted manner on your blemishes and you combine it with the foundation, which is very light coverage, then this can also be a great everyday look. So I'm just mainly tapping this in places where I could use a little bit more help. And then going back in with that sponge, I'm just going to tap that in and also put this on my eyelid for primer. So the sponge definitely left a relatively light layer of coverage. So on my bigger pimples, I'm just going to add a little bit more coverage. And this time just tap it in lightly with a finger to try to preserve some of that coverage. So with the concealer down, let's go in with some setting powder. So I have here the under eye setting powder from Pat Mcgrath. And I must admit, this is actually not my favorite powder to use, especially whenever I use this Pat McGrath concealer. I do find that with this powder, a very, very little amount goes a long way. And so it's really excellent if you want a super lightweight powder because you really don't need very much to set the skin. But at the same time, you do have to be a little bit careful because especially in the under eye area, I find that the Pat McGrath concealer by itself tends to be pretty self-setting. And so at least on my dry skin, if I really go in heavily with this powder under the eye area, then it just ends up looking really, really dry. So I'm using here this very, very light, fluffy Wayne Goss brush, since I find this just leaves a very, very small amount of powder. But I did want to mention that because I feel like a lot of people really love this powder. And for me, I like it, but I do find it a little bit finicky to use. But if your skin is more on the oily side, you might really enjoy this. So of course, this is technically an under eye setting powder, but I'm going to just use this lightly all over my face because this is the one powder that I have from Pat McGrath. Alrighty, so here we have the simple everyday base down. So I'm gonna go off camera to do my brows and bronzer, which are products that Pat McGrath does not have. And then I'll be back to do the rest of my face and lips, and then we can dive into the eyeshadows. So here we have the brows and the bronzer down. So now let's get into some blush. So for an everyday work look, there are 3 blushes from Pat McGrath in particular that I would recommend checking out. So first off, we have Fleurtatious. So I would say if your skin tone is on the fair to tan side, Fleurtatious is a really great option if you're looking for a demi-matte blush that is pretty neutral overall. You can see it does run slightly pinky, but as far as the Pat McGrath line goes, this is definitely the lightest, most neutral blush among the demi-matte finish. Now, when you look at this one in pan, it looks extremely light. The first few times I saw it, I assumed it wouldn't work well on my skin tone, but actually it works pretty well up to, I would say, a tan skin tone. If you've watched Alicia Archer's videos on YouTube, she has worn this a few times and it's looked really nice on her medium to tan skin. The next blush that's really great for a more everyday basis is this Desert Orchid blush. And this does have shimmers in it. So whether this is the blush for you depends a little bit on how you feel about having shimmer on your cheeks at work. If you're okay with that, this is a really beautiful, relatively nude shade. So it has a strong peachy, rosy, bronzy tone to it. And so on the skin, it looks relatively natural. It's not going to give you that pink flush like you're blushing. Instead, it's going to give you more tan and glow. And then the last blush I'd recommend is Paradise Venus. So this is a deeper blush, so I think this is excellent if you do have a deeper skin tone. This is a terracotta blush, and so similar to Desert Orchid, it'll give you more of that sort of tan healthy look rather than a blushing look. And also this is in her demi-matte finish, so really great if you'd rather not wear shimmery blushes to work. For today's look, I'm going to try to showcase all 3 of these on my cheeks in some way, just so you guys can see them a little bit. But of course, for an actual work day, you probably would only want to go in with one of these. So with my Cheek Pro from Sonia G, I'm going to first go into Fleurtatious. And I'll put this on this side of my cheek for you guys to see. And I'm going to try to keep this relatively light because, of course, I actually want this look to be a work look at the end of the day. But hopefully you guys can see that shade. Let me actually cut down the brightness a little bit, so hopefully you can see the color a little bit better. As you can see here, that just provided a little bit of flush to this cheek, relatively natural, nothing like you have really bright pink cheeks or anything, but enough to give you that sort of healthy blushed look. And then on the other side, I'm going to go into Desert Orchid, which again, I think is great if you would rather not have really any pink in your cheek look, but you are okay with a little bit of shine. So there we go. We have Desert Orchid on this side. And honestly, looking at my face straight on right now, I think if you do a light layer of either of these, they kind of look fairly similar. So normally I would build it up a little bit more because I do like having quite a bit of a blushed look. But for this sort of everyday work look, I think, you know, probably stopping here is good because we're trying to do that whole no makeup thing. And one thing I really love about these Pat Mcgrath blush formulas, especially the lighter ones, is you can really sheer them out or build them up. Because they have this baked formula, it's not like you're going to pick up a ton of product on your brush right away. So now cleaning off that brush, I'm going to go briefly into Paradise Venus just so you guys can see a little bit of the shade. Honestly, for my skin tone, I have to be a little bit careful with this shade if I'm using it for work. But for today, I'm going to kind of concentrate this more on the outside portion of my cheeks. So hopefully you guys can see a little bit just how the shade looks. So as you guys can hopefully see on that side, it's definitely a little bit deeper than the other ones, but I think the shade on this is still pretty neutral. And so this shade, this terracotta shade, is kind of like that summery sunburnt look. So if you use it very lightly, it can look relatively natural, just like you've sort of been in the sun. But there you go. I think actually I did a better job on this side. But you can combine these if you want that sort of gradient effect, which, I mean, if you're just going to work, this is probably a lot more work than you want to do with your makeup in the morning. But just to show you guys how that would look. So I'm going to skip highlight today just because typically for myself, if I'm going to work, I don't really go in with a lot of highlighter. But I will say if you are interested in wearing a Pat Mcgrath highlighter to work, the Divine Rose highlighter is really great for a pretty natural sheen. That one is definitely the least beaming of Pat Mcgrath's highlighters. But also her Divine Glow formula, so this Venus Nectar one and also the Golden Nectar shade, those, if you apply them with a very light hand, can also be relatively natural. But this formula does pick up a lot more than the Divine Rose one, because that one is a baked gelée formula. So those would be the Pat Mcgrath highlighters I would recommend if you want to go in with highlighter. So next up are lip products, and these are the lip products from Pat Mcgrath in my collection that I would recommend if you want a really simple everyday makeup look. So first off, Pat Mcgrath's lip gloss formula is really excellent if you are okay with having a pretty glossy lip. It does dry down to a more natural finish, but it does start out very high shine. But I picked out here some shades that are relatively natural, so hopefully that still works for your workplace environment. So first off, we have Love Potion, and this is a very light shade. So there is a little bit of glitter in this shade, but overall it is extremely sheer and just provides a slight pink tint to the lips. Let me actually turn down the brightness further. Next, we have Dare to Bear, which is quite similar to the previous one, Love Potion. Basically, these are both very sheer, but Dare to Bear just has maybe slightly more pigmentation to it, a stronger pink, and less peachy. Next, we have Divine Rose. So if you want something that has more of a plummy undertone to it, this is a great option. And this is in that same shimmer formula, but the shimmers are slightly less obvious because of the pigmentation. Then we have Sunset Rose. And I think for many folks, this is a favorite everyday shade. I've heard Jenna Fraze really rave about this shade. And as you can see, this is just a little bit more peachy than Divine Rose, but same formula. And then finally, we have Flesh 6, and this is actually my favorite everyday shade from Pat Mcgrath. This is a little bit deeper than the rest. It is a high gloss formula, so it doesn't have any shimmer particles in it. But I find this shade to be really flattering on an everyday basis on my skin tone. It has a little bit more brown in it than the rest of the shades that run more pinky peach. If you don't want something that is really glossy though, I would highly recommend checking out her lip balms. And I personally love these little minis. So first off, I have the lip balm in Blow Up. And so you can see this is a pretty sheer formula, so really great for everyday wear. And this one is a really nice peachy pink, so relatively natural. This is also just one of the most comfortable lip balms that I've ever tried. It's very light on the lips, does not feel thick at all, so I really love that aspect. And this shade over here is Flesh 3. You can tell it's a little bit more pigmented. It's quite similar to Flesh 6. And for me, this is definitely one of my go-to Pat Mcgrath lip products whenever I'm at work. So actually for today's look, I'm going to put on Flesh 3 just to show you guys how this looks, because I think this one is really nice and versatile. Of course, if you want a lighter lip look, then Blow Up or any of those lip glosses would be really excellent. But here we are. You can see that was really easy to apply, but there's actually a pretty decent amount of pigmentation with this lip balm, despite the fact that it's really light and comfortable on the lips. And here's a close-up of the swatches. So first off, we have Fleurtatious, Desert Orchid, and Paradise Venus from her Divine Blush line. And then we have Love Potion, Dare to Bear, Divine Rose, Sunset Rose, Flesh 6, Blow Up, and Flesh 3. So with the rest of the face done, now let's go into the Pat Mcgrath Mothership palettes. So of course, Pat Mcgrath Mothership palettes are considered among the creme de la creme of eyeshadow palettes. They come in this gorgeous black lacquer packaging with these large beveled mirrors and 10 beautiful eyeshadows. Pat Mcgrath has come out with a wide variety of different color stories, but none of them are necessarily an everyday neutral palette. So in order to create everyday neutral looks, we do have to be a little bit creative. So let's start by just breaking down the anatomy of a Mothership palette. So all Motherships come with 10 eyeshadows, but it's helpful to think about them in two parts. So for all of the Motherships other than Decadence, you have 6 eyeshadows over here that tend to be a little bit more everyday neutral shadows, as you can see here in the Sublime palette. This is Mothership 2. And then you have 4 down here, which are in her Blitz Astral formula. So these are typically baked shadows, and they're very high shine, very glittery. So for the purposes of today's look, we will not be dipping into any of these Blitz Astral shades. But when it comes to these 6 at the top, you can always be sure that in Pat Mcgrath Mothership palettes, all of them other than Decadence, and I'll talk a little bit about Decadence later on, all of them will have a Skin Show shade here. So Skin Show shade is basically like a highlighter. It's a pretty sheer, shimmery shade. And so typically this is what you would use for your inner corner or brow bone. And then they'll have at least 2 mattes. So one lighter matte and then one deeper matte. And depending on the palette, the lighter matte might be really light or the deeper matte might be really deep. So we'll run through that in more detail later on in this video. And then also in the 6-pan area, you will always have a bronze metallic. So this is this shade over here in this palette. And then the remaining 2 shadows will either be 1 matte and 1 metallic or 2 metallics. And so for example, in Sublime, we have 2 metallic shades over here. And the reason I'm breaking this down is for today's look, we're going to really focus on these 4 types of shades in Mothership palettes. So the Skin Show shade, the lighter matte, the deeper matte, and then the bronze shade. And I'm going to focus on that because that is consistent regardless of which Mothership you have. And so I obviously can't use all 9 of my Motherships for today's look. But hopefully by doing a couple looks with this sort of pattern, you can just mix and match the shades depending on which Mothership you have in your collection. And so for this first look, I'm going to use Sublime, and then I'll use another one of my Motherships for the next look. So to start out, let's just do a super simple look. The simplest look that you could possibly do, which is taking a small fluffy brush, and I have here my reference number 14. You can just use the Skin Show shade and just sweep that all over your lid lightly. If you're going for just a really simple, glowy, one and done type of look. And again, I just have the concealer down as primer today. Sweeping that also on the inner corner area, and then lightly sweeping some of that on the lower lash line as well. So this, I would say, is definitely the easiest possible look if you have a really, really conservative workplace and you just want to have a one and done. The Skin Show shade in any Pat McGrath palette is a really great way to go. Of course, though, for today's look, we're not going to stop at this. So next up, I'm going to go into this deeper shade over here. So this is the lightest matte in this palette. In many of the other Pat McGrath Motherships, you will have a matte that's even lighter than this, but since I'm using the Sublime shade, this is the lightest option. So I'm just going to use this lightly in the outer third just to add a little bit of definition to this look. And I'm using that same reference number 14 brush since, you know, for everyday makeup, you don't want to be using like 5 or 10 brushes. So you can see I'm just adding a tiny bit of shadow, and the goal is I don't actually want to look like I'm necessarily wearing makeup. I just want to add a little bit of definition to my eyes. So there we go, just a tiny bit of shadow on the lid. And then I'm also going to just take a tiny bit of that on the tip of this brush and sweep it on the outer third of the lower lash line as well. Honestly, I think for myself, this is probably where I would leave it if I were wearing this to work. And then I would just add a little bit of eyeliner. You could also skip eyeliner and just do a little bit of mascara. But for the sake of today's look, we are going to amp it up one more step so you guys have options. So now I'm going to take a tiny little pencil brush. I have here my reference number 3, and I'm going to dip into this black shade just on the tip, and I'm going to use this really close to the lash line, so kind of like a liner, just to provide some more definition. And I'm also going to sweep a tiny bit of that on the lower lash line as well. Alrighty, there we go. So that just added a little bit more definition. And if you're worried about the black being too harsh, you can obviously use this shade instead. Or you can also go in with this kind of on top of that just to smoke it out a little bit. But this is also a way to do it if you don't want to go in with liquid liner. You can just kind of have a more diffused liner look by using the eyeshadow. So there we go, one look down, and I think you can see from this example that it's pretty easy to use these 3 types of shades, Skin Show and 2 mattes, to just create a really easygoing everyday look. Of course, some of you might be thinking right now, well, what if I have one of those palettes where the mattes are kind of purpley or pinky or coral, and I don't really want to wear a pinky, coral, purple look to work? So in those cases, that's when I think the bronze shade is really helpful. So I'm actually going to take now my Huetopian Dream palette, since I think this is a really good example of a Pat McGrath palette where it might be a little bit harder to use this sort of technique. I actually have tried this with this palette, and these 2 shades here definitely have enough purple in them that if you really want something that's neutral, then this trifecta is probably not the best way to go. So instead, we're going to try going in with this bronzy shade over here. So taking a reference number 26 brush, which is more of a fat pencil brush, I'm going to just glide this somewhat close to the lash line. So we're trying to do a very simple one and done type of look. But to keep it really everyday, I'm really concentrating the pigment near the lash line and then just kind of blending and diffusing it upwards. Bring a little bit of it up in the outer third. Give a tiny bit of a cat eye effect. And then cleaning off my reference number 14, I'm going to now go into the Skin Show shade in this palette and sweep that on the inner portion and kind of blend outwards. And kind of use whatever is on my brush to further diffuse the edges of this look. Because again, we want this to be very, very everyday friendly, so nothing too shiny, just very, very soft. Alrighty, so here we have this eye done, and that was just a really simple look with just 2 shadows. If you don't like the kind of highlight that the Skin Show shade is providing, of course you could just do the bronze shade and not go in with the Skin Show shade. But I do think the Skin Show shade is helpful for just kind of blending things out a little bit more and adding a little bit of light to the look. Now for the lower lash line, I'm gonna use the tip of that same Rephr number 26, because again, we don't wanna use a ton of brushes for this everyday look, and just sweep this on the outer half of the lower lash line and blend it out. Alrighty, so here we have the simple eye look that uses the bronze shade and the skin show shade. So if you're using a palette where the deepest shade is neutral enough for you, you can of course do what I did on this side and then go in with the eyeshadow as liner. For this Huetopian Dream palette, I do worry that this still might be a little bit on the plummy side. So I put on some eyeliner on my lash line and my waterline. And I actually ended up switching out the lip color because I wanted something that was a little bit less vibrant, a little bit more nude. And so I went in with my Pat Mcgrath lip liner in the shade Undone. And then on top of that, I put the Flesh 6 lip gloss. So what do you guys think about the final look? So on this side, we have a simple eye look using just the bronzy shade and the skin show shade. And then on this side, we have two of the mattes and the skin show shade from Sublime. I will say originally I was planning to go in and sort of fix the sides so they looked a little bit more even, but actually the looks are similar enough that I think I can just wear them as is. So now I'm sure a lot of you are watching this video and wondering, okay, given that there are 9 Pat Mcgrath Motherships, which Pat Mcgrath Motherships are best for everyday wear, for wearing to work? So now I'm going to run through all 9 motherships and quickly give you guys my thoughts in terms of how to wear them to work and which ones are easier to use for that purpose. So let's do this in order, starting out with Mothership 1 Subliminal. And overall, this is a really easy to use palette for everyday looks if you like more cool toned neutral shades. So basically, if you cover up this side, you can see that this is a very neutral palette. So essentially you have a nice skin show shade. This palette actually has 3 mattes, so a lot to play around with for some different depths. And then of course you also have a nice bronzy shade as well. Of course, if you have a really warm skin tone or if you just don't really like cool toned neutrals, this is maybe not the best palette because these shades can run a little bit gray. But for me personally, if I were using this as an everyday palette, I would go in with this all over the crease area, add some of the skin show shade, and then if I want some more depth or if I want something along the lash line, I would go in with this mid-tone slate shade. Or alternatively, I would just drag this along the lash line like I did on this side and just diffuse it upwards. Next, we have Mothership 2 Subliminal, and this is definitely the palette I would say is the easiest to make very everyday neutral looks with. A lot of other palettes from Pat Mcgrath run either on the cool side or the warm side, but this one, especially if you cover up these Blitz Astral shades, is very neutral. So essentially any of these 6 here are great for an everyday look. So of course we have the shades that I used in today's look, the skin show shade, and then we have these 2 mattes. But this shade over here is also really excellent for an everyday look, as are these 2 over here, just depending if you want more of a peachy, bronzy, or pinky look. So if you're looking at Pat Mcgrath's motherships and trying to find something that is really usable for everyday, this is a great palette to look into. I will say for me personally, this is not my favorite palette because I don't find these Blitz Astrals to be particularly exciting. But if you are primarily using this for more neutral, natural looks, these are excellent. And also none of these metallics are very high shine. These are more in her smooth satin metallic formula. So moving right along, we have Mothership 3 Subversive. And this is definitely a palette I would say is a little bit harder to use for everyday looks. Of course, you can still do what we did in today's looks and basically go in with the skin show plus these 2 mattes. This will give you a very similar look to what we did on this side with the Sublime look. And then this bronze shade over here, I think is still neutral enough to easily go for a more everyday look using the technique that we have on this side. The rest of the shades in this palette though are definitely pretty colorful. So if you have a more conservative workplace, you might be a little bit more limited in terms of how many different looks you can get from this. In general though, as you can see from these swatches of the first 3 motherships, One thing I will note is all three of the first Motherships come with a black shade. Their skin show shades are not particularly different. And so if you are primarily looking for an everyday palette, you definitely don't need to have all three of these, because the biggest differences between these three palettes are definitely in the additional shades rather than in these mattes, bronzes, and skin show shades. Moving right along, let's talk about Mothership 4 Decadence. And so this palette is quite special in that it's the only Pat Mcgrath Mothership that has exclusively metallic formulas. So you're not going to have a skin show formula, you're not going to have any matte formulas, and you're not going to have any Blitz Astral formulas. So if you want the full Pat Mcgrath experience, I definitely recommend starting out with one of the other Motherships. But if you do primarily do one and done metallic looks on an everyday basis, then this is a really great palette to have in your arsenal. So essentially for everyday looks with this palette, this shade over here is really excellent to go into. This is a really nice peachy shade. It does have a decent amount of reflect to it, so you probably want to use it more so in this way where you really smudge it out. You can also do a similar thing with this shade over here, though this one does have a little bit of a blue undertone to it, so it depends how comfortable you are with that. And then this shade over here, which is pretty taupey, is probably the most everyday friendly shade. So you can definitely put this all over the lid for a pretty subtle look. If you want to add a little bit more depth, going into Blue Blood over here is also a good option. If you just take a really tiny amount of this and maybe deepen up the outer corner with this all over the lid. Again, these are all metallic shades, so definitely a little bit more shine on the lids. Next, we have Mothership 5 Bronze Seduction, and this palette has a really strong reputation as an everyday neutral palette, or at least as everyday and as neutral as Pat Mcgrath Motherships go. Because if you cover this up, it is a pretty simple color story. As the name suggests, it's very, very bronzy. That said, in my opinion, I don't think that this is actually any better for an everyday basis than a lot of other Pat Mcgrath palettes. Because again, you have here your skin show and your mattes, and this purple matte over here is not really something I would recommend for an everyday look. So actually, let me just swatch the two mattes that I would recommend. I mean, you can go in a little bit with the aubergine shade, but for today's video, we're really focusing on very simple everyday looks. So of course, this trio here is really great. And then if you wanted to do a little bit more shine or color, you have this bronze and this taupey bronze over here. This shade though is like always hard panned. I don't know why. It's kind of one of my major pet peeves with this palette. It's a really pretty shade, but it's a little bit hard to get the pigment off the pan. And that was true even when this palette was brand new. So you can definitely also use this, for example, the way we did today on this side and just kind of smudge it out and blend it upwards. One caveat I do have with this palette though is these mattes are very pigmented. So when you look at Sublime, that mid-tone matte looks really dark, but as you could probably see when I did today's look, it actually shears out pretty easily and blends to be really natural looking. These two mattes definitely pack much more of a punch, so just be a little bit careful with this palette. In general, I would definitely recommend Subliminal or Sublime over Bronze Seduction if you're primarily going for pretty subtle everyday looks. Next up, we have Midnight Sun, and this is a palette that at first might not look at all like an everyday makeup palette because we do have this blue here, but actually, especially if you cover up this side, it is a relatively neutral palette, and in particular, I find that the Skin Show shade plus this matte here are really excellent if you want that really subtle everyday look. Basically, the Skin Show doesn't have a ton of pigment to it. And then this ochre shade, at least on my skin tone, is a really perfect contouring shade for the eye socket. So if you want something that looks pretty natural, that just adds a little bit more definition to the eye, this is a really excellent shade. And then this darkest matte is also one that can be used in a more natural way. It's kind of a charcoal color, so a little bit cool toned, but it blends out pretty easily. Other than that, of course, we have this bronze shade over here, which is a little bit lighter than some of the previous bronzes, but still could be used very easily for this kind of look. And then depending on how you feel about wearing greens to work, this shade is actually a relatively neutral shade as well. It's more of that kind of olive, bronzy gold green shade rather than like a bright emerald green. So this is also really great for an everyday look. So definitely don't sleep on Midnight Sun when it comes to creating more everyday Pat Mcgrath looks. So now let's get into the Divine Rose family, starting with Mothership 7. And for these Divine Rose palettes, it really comes down to how you feel about having some mauvey, peachy, plummy shades in your everyday look. For me personally, I love these palettes for days when I'm not going to work, but I still want something that's really fun and wearable. But depending on your preferences, this might also work well for going to the office. So here with Divine Rose 1, we have, of course, the Skin Show shade and the two mattes. And this deeper matte especially is actually pretty good for a really neutral look. It's more mahogany than plum, whereas Velouria, the lighter matte, definitely has a pretty strong purpliness to it. So I would say if you don't want that purple element, just stick to these two shades. And then the rest of the metallics in this palette are also pretty decent for an everyday look. So you have one that is a little bit more taupey rose bronze, and one that's a deeper bronze, and then you have this rose shade. So any of these sheared out can be really great for an office look as well. So in a way, I would think of Divine Rose 1 as kind of being the mauvey counterpart to Sublime in terms of having a lot of the shades out of the 6 here being really good for simple everyday looks. Moving now to Divine Rose 2, this is definitely a little bit more tricky to create a super natural look with. Definitely these shades are meant to pop. So I would say that these might be a little bit harder to use for this kind of look over here because as you can tell, this matte is very peachy and this one is very purpley. So it just depends on your comfort level with having some colors in your everyday work look. And then these two metallics are also a little bit rosy in hue, though I think you could use this deeper one over here in a similar manner to what we did on this eye. This bronze rosé shade also is pretty nice if you're comfortable having a little bit of glimmer on the eyes. The shade is not so distinct from a skin tone's, so it's still relatively natural. But on the whole, I would say if you want a true neutral look for work, this is probably not the best palette to dig into. And then finally, we have the most recent Mothership palette. So this is Huetopian Dream Mothership 9. And as you guys saw on this side, my recommended approach to this would be a combination of the Skin Show shade and the bronze shade. I think that's really excellent for a really simple everyday look if you're going for something more neutral. There are also these two mattes that you can use, and I'm running out of space, so let me put these on my hand. But I think as you can see in these swatches, they do have a much stronger mauvey, pinky, plummy tone to them than some of the other mattes. And so this will bring some color to your look, depending on how you feel about that. So similar to Divine Rose 2, I would say there's not a ton of options in this palette for a neutral everyday look, but you can still throw something together as I did on this side of my face today. So that's all of the Pat Mcgrath motherships, but I will also just briefly mention Voyeuristic Vixen, which is one of her quads. I think this one is, of all her quads, one of the most everyday friendly. Bronze Borealis, which I don't have, is also one that would be a good contender for this. But you can do with this palette a look similar to either side of my face today. So you can use the Skin Show shade plus this matte to do a look like this. Or you can use the bronze shade plus the Skin Show shade in order to do a look like this side. These shades do pack a punch though, like this matte is pretty pigmented and this bronze is pretty shimmery. So this is not a palette I would necessarily suggest you run out and buy right away if you want something more on the subtle side. But if you want something that gives you that full Pat McGrath experience but can also be toned down for everyday wear, then this is a pretty good palette to check out. On the whole, I would say that if you like cool tone neutrals, Subliminal is the best palette to go for. If you want true neutrals, then Sublime is the best. If you want something that's a little bit deeper and more bronzy, then Bronze Seduction can be good. If you really like olive tones or ochre tones, Midnight Sun is great. And if you're okay with having a little bit more mauviness in your look, then Divine Rose 1 is excellent for an everyday work look. So that's it for today's video. Hopefully this was helpful for any of you who have been looking into Pat McGrath products or who have some Pat McGrath products at home and have been brainstorming ways to use them in your everyday makeup routine. On the whole, I would say Pat McGrath is definitely a brand that generally leans more towards full glam looks with lots of color and sparkle. But as you can see from today's look, you can also tone things down and do something more simple that is suitable even for pretty strict work environments. Of course, everyone has their own makeup preferences and styles, so I would love to hear down in the comments down below how you guys use your Pat McGrath products when you go to work. Are there certain products that you use in your everyday rotation? Also, I would love to hear what you guys thought about this style of video. And if there's any other questions that you'd like me to answer in video form about Pat McGrath or different makeup styles, definitely let me know. So thank you all so much for joining me today. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!